Thanks everybody for coming today. It's a rainy day here. It's nice to be back on the islands as set up from Cortez, and I just love going back to any of the Gulf Islands and being in communities that are in places like this. And it's always nice to see everybody coming right up to the front row as well, which is often unusual at talks. I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an overview of my career to date. And talking specifically to start with about this work weather patterns, which is where the piece that's in the Art Prize exhibition comes from. If anybody has any questions during the talk, I'm happy to answer them as we go, and we'll have a little session at the end as well. All right. So yeah, I was born and raised on Cortez Island, and I ended up in Victoria after that, and then on to Vancouver, where I was a commercial photographer for 12 years. And then I decided to move into the arts as well, and that was around 2008 when I began that, and things are moving along nicely at this stage of the game. And all of my work is based on my beginnings on Cortez, and specifically my parents and the community on Cortez, which of course are very environmentally focused, and consequently that's where the heart of my work lies. This series, Weather Patterns, is a series that's been going on for this is its 9th year now of daily practice. I make a photograph every single day, and so this is, as I said, this is year 9, this series is an attempt to visualize the milestones that are occurring as climate change advances. And by milestones, I mean the records that are being broken. Well, about 9 years ago, maybe 8.5 years ago, I was reading, of course, a lot of articles about this, particularly in The Guardian. Their environmental coverage is very comprehensive. And they constantly were issuing articles about the climate records that were being broken. Another record for the hottest month, hottest July, the hottest 2010. All of these records that we still see are being broken, and I'm sure we will not see the end of that for a very long time, sadly. And so I felt some need to visualize this and make a project about that. And so I started when I was back on Cortez. I was living back on the family farm at that time, 9 years ago, and I just photographed the view from the front of the house at that time. And I go out every day and just make a record of those. And so when I would come across, here's a few of the records that I've made work about. And essentially, whatever the record is that is being broken, that becomes the title of the work. And so in a sense, each one is quite a distinct record of that. Now, I would call them anecdotal records, not scientific records. There's certainly a lot of those around as well, because the odd time, if I'm traveling or something like that, I can't actually photograph here in the Pacific Northwest. If I'm anywhere, Cortez, Victoria, Salt Spring, anywhere around here, I make a photograph. If I travel further afield, then I don't make a photograph that day, just for obvious reasons. But for me, the important part is the actual finished print, because of this archival recording of history. Yes.
You make those all with the same aperture?
Yes,
at the time?
Absolutely. Everything is very, very consistent in terms of that. So I head out here's me. This is where I've been shooting in Victoria for the last 4 years. Just near Trial Island there. There's a little park called Trafalgar Park, and I would go there every single morning. And I moved in Victoria now, and now do it at Mile Zero at Dallas Road, which seems to be a rather appropriate name for where I'm making this series. And yes, I go every day, and I have the same camera with the same lens and the same focal length and all of those parameters. The only thing that ever changes is the shutter speed. So really just, again, a lot of my work is archival in nature, and this series is also exactly that. So really those sort of consistent parameters. So it does have links to sort of science and the sort of the recording methods that are used in scientific studies in terms of consistent parameters as much as possible. Hi, Stacia.
Hi, David.
But it does ebb and flow as well. So the ones we've been looking at so far, these are all the records of maybe I'll just flip back a little bit here, back to the start there. So 2018, this is all the days I photographed in 2018. And then 2017 and 16 and 15 and 14. And I would say half of these ended up being the hottest years on record. And as many of you will know, the last 10 years contain 9 of the hottest years on record. So, so it just seems to be continually ramping up these here. Here's 2013 and 2012, and you can see through this too how the series has progressed as I sort of got my feet wet in this series and really figured out what it was about. When I first began this project, I do quite a lot of long-term projects. I wasn't really sure exactly what I was setting out to do. And so I wasn't as diligent in making these records, but I knew with what was going on environmentally that I had to do something and I needed to mark something, so I just began. And I knew that I would find my way just through that process of making the work and then coming to sort of figuring that out at a later date. But I'm a big fan of letting the work kind of direct you and being able to flow through that and figuring out what the heck you were doing perhaps at a later date. I follow those urges quite a bit. You can see the Quadra Island just on the tip of the on the right hand side there. I would photograph with that dead center every day.
Do you try and go at the same time, or do you care?
It depends where I am. When I was on Cortez, we were on the very south tip of the island, and there was a gigantic reef that goes out. So when the tide is low, you have half a mile of exposed beach. And for myself, I was really intent on that combination of land, sea, and sky being in the photograph every time. And with that half a mile of exposed beach, it interfered with the visual consistency of the photographs. So I would always shoot at high tide. Now I'm in Victoria, and that's less of an issue now because of the layout of the beach and the high banks there along the waterfront there. I get up, and that's the first thing I do every day. I just go down and first thing in the morning, get that out of the way. Otherwise, I get a little bit stressed as the day goes on, and I haven't gotten down there yet. So these really have an interest in looking at things that we have a hard time perceiving as humans. It appears, and that is this incremental change that's happening. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we're where we're at right now with the environmental crisis. The work that I have here in the Art Prize exhibition was photographed in 2018 in Victoria during the wildfires and all the smoke, which you guys will all be well acquainted with here on Salt Spring. I think the crisis was as bad here on Salt Spring as it was elsewhere in BC. Did you guys have a fire here as well, or did you get away without having a big one? Just the smoke, right? Yes. So this is on Gonzales Hill here by the observatory in Victoria one night, and I would just again I was moved to go and photograph every day, and sometimes for hours at a time, that smoke that was happening in the city. Not quite aware of why I was doing that yet, but I knew that it needed to be recorded, and so that's exactly what I did. And I would go out and then come back to the studio and make these photographs. Make these compilations from all those photographs that I had taken. So these ones here, you can see when you get in close that each little slice here is a single photograph that I made as the sun was ascending through the smoke in the morning. So you can kind of see how that's happening there, and as the light rises there on the right hand side and as the day progresses. And here is the sun as it's setting. The descent of the sun just into that red smoke in the horizon there, and again you get a real feel for that. And again, with each little slice of these photographs here, essentially archiving this descent of the sun as it sets into that smoky horizon. And I mean, there's so much evidence of that smoke even just up in here, and the color as it progresses was quite something to see. And then these ones here. The descent of the sun again. This gets back to the archival nature of these prints, and this is the one that is actually in the exhibition here. The ascension of the sun through the smoke of the wildfires there. So there's these certain events that seem to be happening. Of course, we had that in 2017, and I made a series all-in-one photograph from that particular year, and then these are all from 2018, and I'm very happy to report I couldn't make any this year, so so we'll see how long that lasts. This one here, this is one of the ones from this year already, and this is from I believe it was March 20th was the first day of spring, and we had 48 temperature records broken that day here in BC. So I took just a single photograph of that day and multiplied it 48 times in representation, and made this piece here, and of course the title becomes exactly that. The first day of spring, March 20th, 48 records broken in British Columbia. Yes?
What were the records broken?
Pardon me?
What records were broken?
Temperature records.
In height or in heat or what?
In heat, yes. So 48 temperature records were broken. That's all around BC, right? So. Yeah. And I also do take time out from the series, and I make the odd one that is not necessarily with a record, associated with a record. This one is just dissipating heat. Summer Evenings 2017. We had, again, really hot summer that year, and I went down every day to that tip of land on the corner of the golf course in Oak Bay. And one of the few places where you can get a horizon line like that in this area without running into an island or the US. And make these photographs here as the sun setting, and the exposure has to get longer and longer and longer as the sun sets, and consequently you get waves as it's brighter here that are distinct, and as the exposure lengthens, you get this softening effect as you start shooting for seconds and then minutes as well, and it all blends together there. And of course the colors change the longer the exposure goes as well. This series is heading next summer to the San Jose Institute of Contemporary Art. It's going to be the first time it's going to be shown in its entirety down there. And they're going to be projections. We're going to be projecting these in a darkened room on all four walls, so the viewers will be bathed in the actual grids as they walk into the room. And then this is just a composite I made for the pitch for the exhibition to the gallery there. So if anybody happens to be down in California next summer, feel free to drop by. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other work that I have done as well. The last stand is currently right now in the Campbell River Museum. This series is one that's very personal to me, and it's to do with logging in British Columbia. And my family has been intimately acquainted with the logging industry in BC, especially around Cortez Island. I have 5 generations in my family are loggers. My brother currently is a faller, and he still falls old growth when they come across it in their cut logs, because it's approved by our government currently. So I believe the NDP is talking about doing something about that, but we'll see what happens. I was raised, as I said, on Cortez, and I was raised on this 96-acre piece of property, an organic farm on the very south tip of Cortez, most of it forested, and the second growth forest that we have on pretty much all of the islands around here. And of course, walking through the forest every day as a child to go to school, I would walk along a mile-long driveway to get to the school bus. And walking by these stumps, as I'm sure everybody here is well aware of, what the feeling you get when you walk through these forests and these ancient sort of artifacts that have been left behind are there. And so these stumps have always sort of been in me, you know. And as I was getting older and I became a photographer, and I was getting into as I transitioned into the arts, I realized that there was a project here to do. And so I started photographing all of the stumps on the farm. Because most of the land is forested, about 20 acres is cleared and the other 70 plus acres is actual forest. And through that process I discovered that it was actually my great uncle and great grandfather who actually cut these trees down. So then there was a lot of, and here they were doing that. So I started really looking at this. It became even more of a personal project because, of course, with my family history in logging and currently in logging, my brother, as I mentioned, it's really about personal responsibility. and about the responsibility of all of us to be looking at what our actions and how those are affecting the environment now at such a crucial time. And of course that gave it a really personal touch. This is my my great uncle there with the arms akimbo there in front of the truck. So this series I shot over about 5 years. I went out into the forest as I returned to visit. At that point I wasn't living on the island, and I just went back to visit my folks quite often, and I would make photographs, portraits if you will, of many of the stumps. And I was about to release the project and realized that it wasn't quite done, or it wasn't good enough, to be honest, at that point. And so I went back to the forest and I started making these installations in the forest. The one you saw there at the start there, retrieving the old original tools from the Cortez Island Museum. And they let me take them out and head out into the forest and sort of reinstall them, if you will, into the forest. And I also did photographs like this, thinking of, I had, you know, for me there's a great sadness to what's happened in the forest here and what continues to happen. And this particular shot, it took me several tries to get this right, but at least in my mind anyway. For this one in particular, I was thinking of metaphors for bandages and mummification and blankets and comfort and perhaps the shroud, all of those things that sort of a drape of fabric signifies for us. And I also used other devices like this to sort of try and separate these grand artifacts in the forest, which themselves are starting to deteriorate enough that I realized that the last evidence of these forests is now declining as well, and will be disappearing in a generation or two, and so even that will be gone. So I really wanted to get into the forest and sort of make these images and shine a light on these stumps here. Again, some installations with the original logging tools there. I made some grids. I use this grid structure, this process a lot. A lot of times it's used in the arts sort of as a comparative device to compare. For me, in this project in particular, and I'd say in weather patterns as well, it's much more about scale, about attempting to convey the size of the issues that we have upon us. Yes?
So are those different stumps, or are those the same stump, or?
These are all different stumps, but they're all Douglas fir. So I did a grid like this, and these are pieces, they're probably about, when they're actually printed, they're about the size of this screen here. And I did one for Douglas fir specifically, and one for the western red cedar, as those were the two primary commercial harvests that they would make that they make in the forest for the wood. So I thought that was worthy of some photographs here. These are again 100 different stumps. These are the springboard notches that they would cut into the tree and then stand on the springboard so they can cut a little bit higher, which makes the job easier. I thought that was an interesting thing to highlight, being the first cut into these living entities. And then the last couple of photographs here for this series that I'll show you are, again, sort of getting back to what I started with this project, which was essentially looking at these as portraits of these huge stumps. This one in particular, of course, is very reflective of that particular mission there. In terms of forestry, this is a map. I don't know how many of you have seen this yet. It's out fairly recently, but this is a. Has anybody seen this yet? Here? No?
Yes.
Yeah?
On the Guardian page.
Okay, yeah, great. So this is a survey of Landsat images from the satellites that MIT put together. And they have looked at the last almost 20 years, from 2000 to 2018, and the red indicates forest loss on the planet. So, so you can see here in North America, again, the red is the forest that we have lost just in the last 18 years. Okay, and as we zoom into BC here, you can really start to see what's happening. And as we get closer into our neighborhood, you can see what's going all around here is quite significant. I'm glad to say when I see Salt Spring here, it looks like there's just 3 little spots here. Now, I was showing this at this up in Kelm River just 2 weeks ago. I did an artist talk up there specifically about the Last Stand series, and so I focused in on that area around Campbell River. So Cortez, to me, looks very similar to Salt Spring, where there is community outcry and some control over the actual logging and what gets cut here, because you can see here, Cortez has what they call, what is it called now? Changed its name quite a bit. Eco-Forestry Society, and it's a partnership between the First Nations on the island and also the other residents of the island. And basically they have a say in the rate of cut on the crown lands on the island. So you can see when you look at say Quadra Island here and Reed Island and the other spots just around here, the rate of cut on Quadra, say, which is really the closest habitated island, and the difference in the cut that's happening, in my opinion, because of the control of the community over what's allowed to be cut, and that of course gets into discussions about sustainability and what sustainability actually means, a word that I find is used all the time now, but that very, very rarely is actually identified and quantified as what is sustainable. And so this photograph, this compilation from the satellites is quite interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, because just of the power of seeing what's happening to our forests here in British Columbia, and also what can happen when a local community takes control of that and actually wrests that back from the logging companies. That you can still have a logging industry, but it's done in a different manner, in a sustainable manner, yes.
You know when this was taken?
Well, they're up to 2018, the photographs from 2000 to 2018, and then they compiled them from those years. I guess it probably, and then it was published just recently, so I'm sure it took months to put this all together. So.
But there's been a lot more logging done in Salt Spring in the last year. So.
Oh, really? Has there?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't zoom in on Salt Spring, but I should have got one for that. But if anyone is interested, shoot me an email and I'll send you the link for this, because it's quite illuminating. And you can literally, of course, zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. It's although you may not want to be doing that, but.
Does that include forest fires as well as logging?
I'm not sure about that. Actually, I shouldn't say that I'm not sure, because on this on the website that they have there, you can actually have drop-down menus that you can actually specify exactly what you want to see and the different ways that we've had forest loss. I believe that some of this red is total forest loss altogether, which would all indicate mountain pine beetle and forest fires and also logging. So those three things for sure. But that brings us into the climate change debate as well. So and again, if you make it up to Camp River, there's a couple of photographs there from that, and they printed up some quite grand images there at the Camp River Museum, which is very gratifying to see as an artist, I must say. It's open until November the 9th.
Okay.
Yeah. Another long-term series, which I've worked on, I guess it was over the course of 7 or 8 years when I was in Vancouver. Of course, the biodiversity crisis, isn't this a happy artist talk? When there's usually certain moments in my life that really are defining, and one of those was the Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, and the subsequent oil spill that just went on and on and on and on, pouring out millions and millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And that, for me, just galvanized me into making more work and making a series about that. And I was very interested in focusing in, of course, on creatures of the ocean. And looking at work that looks at those creatures, the otherworldly nature of that environment that we hardly ever experience intimately. And I ended up working with the BD Biodiversity Museum in Vancouver at UBC, and I was able to photograph. I had incredible access to their entire collection, which is hundreds of thousands of specimens. And they actually gave me the master key to the museum. I could actually go into any exhibit, even live ones, and if somebody was looking at an exhibit and I wanted to photograph a creature that was in there, I could just excuse myself and unlock it and take it out and back to the labs and photograph that. So if anybody is interested in working with the BD Museum, they are very, very open to working with artists and the community, especially native, bringing projects like this to light. And they have the most phenomenal collection of natural history artifacts in there. So this particular one was photographed on film. I know there's a few film buffs in the crowd here, right, Susan?
Yeah.
And my 4x5 camera, and I would be photographing with expired Polaroid film. This particular little trio is the positive print that I would be photographing. That is the peel apart, of course, Polaroid. With this particular one, it's 4x5 inch film, so it's about that big there. And you peel it apart and you get a positive print, like you do with most Polaroid. But you'd also get a 4x5 inch film negative.
It's a 55.
55, what did I say?
Yeah. ASA 50?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, so
50.
Polaroid Type 55, yes, that's exactly the type of film. So, of course, for reproduction quality, having a 4x5 inch film negative, of course, is rather tremendous. And for this process, with these photographs, I decided to go with solarizing the photographs during development. And what that does, many of you will know that technique, or at least be aware of it visually, maybe not by the actual term, but with Man Ray and the portraiture he did, and other work he did as well, using solarization in the early part of the 20th century. He would just use matches in the darkroom. So basically the process, he would strike a match, it would flare up with the exposed film in the darkroom for a split second and then die out right away. And that process creates a bunch of different effects. This is the positive print, this is the negative that I would get, and this is the final print that I would make. And so you can see in the print here, in the positive print just from the Polaroid here, it's pretty straightforward. So the solarization effect the process has no effect on the positive print. But in the negative, if you'll see things like this little bright line here, which of course this is the negative, so that would actually be dark in the final print. That process of flashing it in the darkroom creates that specific artifact in the film. And then of course in the subsequent print. So it creates these, it also creates a reversal effect that reacts differently depending on temperature and timing and placement of the light. And so you get this albino crow is actually against the little wall, and you can actually see the shadow here. But that reversal effect actually creates, instead of a shadow, it's light. So instead of a shadow, we often think of a drop shadow kind of anchors something to its environment, and especially with studio photography, it can anchor it on this, the sweep of the paper there. But for this particular series, it really ended up lifting the creatures off of the background and almost suspending them or floating them and creating this sort of surreal effect that for me magnified their importance and what I was doing there. You can see again in this one the little tiny black lines along here. It almost outlines almost everything, and it changes every time depending on again the film itself. And I was working with expired film. As I mentioned earlier, Polaroid went out of business in 2008 or 9, so this film was the last of their production. And depending on how it's stored, the film itself can also have some effect from that if it's not stored properly. This is a swordfish skull. Blue marlin skull. So here's a great example of that. The film was sticking together. The film and the print, the positive print, would stick together. And because the film had not been stored properly, and I was buying it off of eBay at this point, I stopped when it was $300 a box. At that point, I called it quits. And that's just for 20 photographs. So but sometimes that can of course have a happy accident, because in this particular photograph, I felt like that worked perfectly with the sort of the element of water, and thinking of water and sand and all those things we think of with the ocean. It seems to me to meld perfectly with this particular work. The red sea urchin. This is another great example of I mean, this is essentially dark, the sea urchin, so the solarization effect essentially reverses it, and it almost becomes a negative again in the print.
These are photographs that you're photographing, or they're specimens that you're
Specimens in a
photographing?
jar?
They're specimens.
And in like a jar, or?
Some of them were in a jar, but most of them are, well, yeah, almost, I would say there's only one or two that were actually in jars.
Yeah.
I was permitted to actually remove them from any kind of casing or jars or anything like that, so I got rather used to the smell of formaldehyde.
What's the name of that museum?
The Beatty,
Beatty?
B-E-A-T-Y.
B-E-A-T-Y, and it's at UBC.
Yes, it's quite an amazing museum, and actually flies under the radar quite a lot. Some people know it because of the blue whale skeleton that hangs in the atrium when you walk in. It's incredible, the blue whale skeleton, as you can well imagine. It's almost like it's in this glass atrium at ground level, so you can see it as you're walking in, and from outside as well. And then the actual museum, you walk down, it's quite a beautiful modern design, and you go down these gigantic concrete ramps underground, where then you see all the museum displays and everything down there. So, but it's really spectacular, and if you have any young folks in your life, take them there, because they'll have a hard time getting out of there for sure. But yeah, they're really great to work with, and again, they have several exhibitions every year too with artist work that creates their work there at the museum. So I was working on this series with the oceans, and I ended up, this is some of the most recent information about biodiversity loss on the planet. And of course then I realized that the oceans weren't alone, that of course every biosphere was in trouble, and I started working on creatures of the sky. And I ended up making a trilogy of land, sea, and sky. And it became, I think there's 134 finished photographs in the entire series, divided into those three sections there. So as I moved along, I focused more and more on endangered species as I moved along, and would go back to the museum and photograph, usually for a day or two at a time, and then spend a couple months finishing the photographs and working on other projects. I usually have sort of 4 or 5 projects on the go at any one time.
Oh, sorry, what was
Yes.
that? What was that we just saw?
This is a feather from a peacock pheasant. And so this is one of the, I'm actually glad you pointed this one out, because this one actually is a fantastic example of what happens when you solarize film, and that reversal effect. Now, of course, this feather is iridescent to begin with, so it already has almost a magical quality to the feather. And then you get in there with light and with solarization, and you can create this reversal effect around here, particularly noticeable in here where it was dark. All right, and there's this dark line now around it. You can see that really up here quite a lot as well, and also around here, around the little spots that are on the feather. And then it really reverses itself in the edge of the film. This border on the mall is actually the edge of the film, so it's just like you would see in 35mm film, where you see little sprocket holes sometimes on the top and bottom. So this is just the product of what this actual type of film.
Are you solarizing the negative? Or
Yes.
So if it doesn't work, you've lost your negative?
Yes. And then, well, it usually always works to some degree. There was maybe 3 or 4 times it didn't work at all, and I had to figure out why that was. But I discovered pretty quickly, early on in the process, of course when you're buying film at that price, you figure things out before you shoot again, as much as you can, that usually around the 17-second mark, 17, 18 seconds is exactly the right time for me to solarize, to flash the film with light. Sometimes the film had been stored incorrectly, and so it wouldn't react as strongly to that effect as it would otherwise.
But you can't now go back and make a conventional print from this negative?
Oh yes, you can, for sure. Yep.
Okay, that's probably a level of detail that I'll ask you about that later.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, it essentially just stays as a regular negative is what happens with that.
You weren't lighting a match either, were you?
No, good. detail-oriented folks here. I like this. No, I was using a flash, like a camera flash, one of those big ones you can remove from your camera. I would just put it right about this far from the film, and then flash it off, and then let it fade away, of course, dissipate. In a black dark room, you can really you make sure you close your eyes, and then wait for the film to finish processing. So basically, like any Polaroid film, it comes in a little pouch. So it's essentially a dark pouch. You know, I can't remember the proper term for that, but. So you expose it when you made the photograph, then I slide it back into the pouch and take it to the dark room later on, usually at the end of the shoot. And then during the development, you would put it through the rollers, like any Polaroid again, you pull it, and essentially those two rollers squeeze the developer onto the negative. And then this film, and typically the temperature that I was doing at, it would be processed for about 25 seconds before I would stop the development. And so usually around the 17 or 18 second mark, I discovered was the time that worked most consistently for me to get a good effect, so the solarization would actually have the strongest effect that it could.
But you can do the same thing with the print, can you not, from the negative? No?
You can solarize paper prints, yes, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, after 7 years I had enough, I guess. These are, of course, getting into creatures of the land there. Elephant's foot. This actually came from Cortez. This artifact is an interesting story. Not the elephant itself, of course, but a family friend who lived in what was then Rhodesia in the 60s and flew his family to Prince George and ended up on Cortez and became our school principal when I was a young boy. Well, of course, in those days in Africa, people had these sort of things. This was actually, I hate to say it, but this was an umbrella stand. And he took his carry-on on the flight, along with his rifle carry-on, if you can believe it, in those days. I love telling this story because it's so shocking now. And he put all of his savings, he had his money in cash for his family, and he put all of his savings at the bottom of this elephant's foot. And on top of that, put he only had one child at that time, but he put her diapers on top of that, which he figured would dissuade anybody from investigating any further into the elephant's foot. So it made it to Canada, and obviously in those days customs had no troubles with that. So and this was sitting when I was a young boy. His daughters were some of my closest friends, and this was just around in the house. And so when I started making this series, and at this time I was living on Cortez again, I was happy to go over there and make that photograph. And of course, talking about that story speaks to the evolution of our opinions and attitudes towards the other inhabitants of our planet. The kiwi bird, the bison hooves. A particularly good example of solarization and that sort of negative effect that can happen from that. Tree frogs, a lion, rattlesnake. And then we get into another body of work that I've been making. What time are we at here? I don't want to go too long here. How are we doing it? Everybody okay?
You've got 15 or 20 minutes left.
Okay, good. So another series that I've been working on, or worked on for quite a long time. Yes?
I want to ask you, your effects are a lot like infrared.
Yeah.
So did you get into infrared too?
I did not. No, I haven't got into infrared yet. There's some of you may know the photographer Richard Mosse. He has done, if you don't know of his work, check him out, MOSSE. He did a series using color infrared film, Kodak color infrared film. Quite a spectacular series. I wish I had one to show you, where he photographed, now what country was it in Africa? I want to say the Congo. But anyway, he photographed these incredible landscape scenes with the inhabitants there, and the landscape, of course, goes pink, bright pink, any foliage. So, of course, the landscapes there were just these incredible photographs of these pink landscapes and this intense, almost like cerulean blue sky from the color infrared as well. I've never used black and white infrared, but have you?
Yes, I use both.
Yeah?
Both.
Yeah. Yes, as you might have seen a little bit now, and you'll see as we go along here, that I do try a lot of different processes. That's one of my, I'm a bit of a restless artist in terms of, I stay within photography, but within photography, I use a lot of different tools. I think that comes a lot from my commercial past as well, where the rate of change and evolution, and any commercial photographers here can recognize this. As the equipment continues to evolve, and of course that evolution is constantly speeding up as cameras change and there's more megapixels and better lenses and all of that stuff. And when I started on film just as digital was coming in. And I also come from a family who likes to take care of their old tools and use them for as long as they can. And so I bought an old Hasselblad camera when I was a student. It was already 30 years old from an old reporter who was retiring, and I felt myself quite disappointed that I couldn't continue to use that for my whole career, because digital came in, and you have to, in the commercial game, you have to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, and make sure you have enough of everything, enough megapixels, enough speed, all that stuff to satisfy your commercial clients. One of the many reasons I ended up getting out of that game. But what that gave me was being able to ebb and flow between equipment and using a range of different things, because you need different equipment for different assignments depending on what the client needed. So that really gave me an appreciation for the craft of photography itself and an exploration of that as well. So this particular series, here's some stuff I was getting together in the studio, and I was looking towards, well, as some of you might have read there, the Anthropocene, as many people here know, we are either still in just barely or have just left the Holocene period, which has been approximately the last 11,500 years, and has coincided exactly with the rise of human civilization. Very stable climate, perfect temperatures for us to rapidly evolve in our civilization, from a civilization point of view. And now, of course, there's a body of scientists out there who have proposed that we now are living in a new age, which is the Anthropocene, which is, of course, anthro is human, due to the incredible effects that our activity are having on the planet. So for me, that was another aha moment when I read that and became aware of that term. Again, courtesy of The Guardian, and I wanted to make a project about that. And so I started collecting I got a human skull, and I got a study skull, and I got all these sort of natural artifacts, bones and skulls. I looked at the history of artifacts. This is actually from King Henry VIII, if you can believe it, from that long ago. And looking at these artifacts that blended the human with the animal. And I looked at my own history, and Anglo-Saxon history, and Vikings, and the combinations that they put into their craft and their boats and all that. I looked at this particular series by a photographer in the late 1800s, Martin Guisine, who was a missionary. And he ended up photographing the last tribe on Tierra del Fuego at the very southern tip of South America. And he came across, his photographs are completely otherworldly to me, and in the outfits and the sort of artifacts, the natural artifacts that they would actually decorate themselves with, which inspired me greatly for this series. And of course, Irving Penn's skull studies, classic photography. I mean, he did that long before things were really happening. And then we get into the series that resulted from my work with this, is creating these sculptures in the studio that have to do with the integration of human and animal, and you might say nature. And of course, this being a study skull, the cap comes off there, the cranium, and of course, thoughts of our brain, our thought process, our evolution all came into that, and I was able to use that cavity to some effect there with this work. This is a great example of using the tools that I have, although they're not that apparent in these projections, but in the actual print. You'll see in the Irving Penn photograph here, the incredible, yeah, I think these were on 8x10 film, if I'm not mistaken, and the incredible detail, if you ever get to see these prints in person, just in this zone here, and as it goes back here, it starts to fall out of focus here. So I wanted to make a series of skull studies, as I have said, and a very classic photography project. It's been going on since photography began, photographing skulls and bones. But I wanted to make it more contemporary as well. So obviously the selection of color contributes to that, but also a process called focus stacking. And some of you here might be aware of focus stacking, but where you basically take multiple photographs. Again, you'll see that consistently through my practice as an artist. And you photograph that at different points of critical focus throughout the object. So you photograph, I'd start here at the nose, and this would be sharp in focus. Then I'd photograph here, I push the focus in, and I go all the way back. So when you actually see these prints in person, the entire object, front to back, is actually very, very crisp, absolutely tack sharp, which was impossible to do with previous camera technology. We've only been able to do that now through this process, just because of the properties of lenses. You literally could not do that, especially when you're up this close to an object. So that was part of the actual process of making this series that intrigued me and contributed to helping bring this sort of study up into modern times. The human studies skull, I had access to one, so I couldn't get a whole bunch of those. Those are very expensive online these days. You can purchase them, surprisingly, online with very little difficulty if you have the funds. This came from the same gentleman who gave me the elephant's foot. Yes, he was a scientist, and this was part of his personal collection. J32, so this is a series of one, and this has to do with the orchids. And some of you might have seen in the winter of 2014-15 the orchid that died up near Comox, and she floated in, and I happened to be on the ferry from Horseshoe Bay when I was listening to CBC, and I heard that they were doing the necropsy that day. So the staff from the Vancouver Aquarium were coming up, and they were going to do the necropsy and discover out why the orchid died. So I burned up Vancouver Island and got there as fast as I can. It had already begun, the necropsy, and was the most incredible scene coming upon this, with hundreds of people around watching, and this loader taking away the little calf that was in her when they cut her open. And this scene presented itself. This was just there. I did not set this up. One of the scientists was there, and they just lifted off the dorsal fin and laid it on the flesh that was there. And as a photographer, of course, you see moments like this, and I stepped across the barrier with the camera in hand and got this photograph, and I still feel, to me, it's probably the most important photograph that I've made in my career so far. And sorry, I get a little bit emotional about this one now, especially considering what's happening with the orchids around here now. And of course, they discovered that the orchid died because of the lack of Chinook salmon. And so she was metabolizing her own blubber because she was starving, and of course that's where all the toxins are stored. And the orchids that we have here are some of the most polluted animals in the oceans of the entire world. So essentially she poisoned herself because she was starving because there's not enough Chinook salmon anymore. So I felt, for me, this became a series of one because I don't need any more than this particular photograph to really hit this series home to me. And they actually have the skeleton being reassembled now for the Royal Victoria Museum. And that's going to be part of a brand new project exhibition. Next summer is going to be the major exhibition at the Royal Museum. And apparently, I've talked to the curator there, they're pulling out all stops to try and really change what's going on with our world right here. Mm-hmm. So I'm really happy that they're doing such a thing with an institution like that. Many times institutions are a little bit hesitant to really sort of punch above their weight and try and affect people like this, but I think it's really important to do so now. It's really important. I'm gonna just push my luck here and do one more little, can I do one more little section, or how's our timing?
One more.
Okay, if anyone needs to go, I will not be offended. So unknown entities, this is my most recent project, and this is to do with the plastics crisis. And so I'm back in Cortez here, and I'm photographing plastic that I find out in the environment, either my own, from my own refuse, or that I find drifted up on the beach, or in the forests, or wherever I find it, which of course is everywhere. And this is one of those fishing buoys that we find that are just drifted around, and doing these long exposures in the evening. A hula hoop that I found. This is off the point on Cortez again. I would rig these things up. This is actually a piece of styrofoam that had drifted in. And I would rig these up with wires, and if they weren't in water, and sort of use the movements and the time, the currents of wind and water, however slight. And so I rigged this up on a very thin wire and then spun it, and the wind just kept it going as I made the photograph for about 30-second exposure. So it just blurs out into this completely unknown, well, that's the name of the series, an unknown entity. And the inspiration for this, I've seen many incredible projects coming out of the artistic community about this particular crisis. And it took me a long time to find one that I felt didn't follow very closely in the footsteps of another artist. And I realized that a lot of it was from, this is one of those chuck-it balls for dogs that glows in the dark. They drifted off as well, so I photographed it at late dusk and charged it up with a flashlight and got it on a wire again and made this ethereal photograph, I should say. But I was very interested in the idea that essentially plastics are an unknown entity for us at this stage, because there has been basically no research done to date. They're just starting now about what the actual effects of plastic are in our environment as it degrades. And for me, that really signified a serious look at how we allow that to happen, how we allow things to be created for our convenience. And I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody for all the things that's them right here. All the things we have in our modern life that are just, rather incredible and have made our lives so incredible. But we don't take the time to think about what happens at the end when we're done with it. And so in a sense, plastics are an unknown entity, and that's exactly why I wanted to call this project by that name and make photographs that are also unknown, because it reflects on that idea. I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to finish off and just thank you very much for all coming out, and I hope this hasn't been too depressing for you, but I would like to close and say, there's still incredible beauty in our world, and I'm out there all the time in it, and yes, there's a lot of terrible things going on, but I think it's very good to be out here. You folks on a place like Salt Spring are intimately acquainted with this type of thing, and that's probably one of the many reasons why you live in a place like this, is that you're still surrounded by the beauty of the world. And I think no matter how bad things get, there's still going to be some of that to take note, and I think that artists in particular are the people who show us that and bring us back to that part. So thank you for coming, and thank you for supporting this incredible show. If you have any questions, shout it out or come to me after. And if you've got to go, get going.
Are you working at all in the film industry?
No, I made a very short, as in one shift venture into that photography world, and realized that also was not my cup of tea at all. Just in terms of, at that point I was assisting one of the set photographers over in Vancouver, and of course, I've had lots of friends who've worked in the film industry for decades, and I know it can be really fantastic, but it's not for me the sitting and waiting part, the 16 or 18 hour shifts, and you do that for 3 months, and then you get 3 months off. Just the life of that is just, it wasn't for me, so.
I was thinking more like nature things or National Geographic.
Yeah, no, I don't do that. I've been published in National Geographic, both online and in print. So I do work with them, but just from a stills perspective. Yeah, I'm not a silent photographer for them or anything like that, but they've seen some of this work and they've published it. So yeah, but I don't do any film. No, I've got enough on my plate with stills. Yes.
I just wondered, what kind of detritus do you lift over from what you do?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, at this point in the game, I think of my back end as well. I'm thinking of, the photographs I print and where they're going to eventually end up and the kind of framing I use. Is that the kind of thing you mean from my industry? And so I use cotton rag papers to print on, and I frame only with wood and glass and paper. So and wire hangers on the back and stuff. So I
Two of those paper and wood, where do they come from?
yeah, they come from trees.
Paper.
Oh, absolutely. As I said earlier, I'm as guilty as
We
anybody.
get around in circles.
Yes.
We try to be green. We really do.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to take systemic change to make anything happen to any degree, for sure. And every industry has to take its part. And I think the arts I'm seeing, I think Canadian Art Magazine actually had a good article about that recently, about looking at the bigger institutions in our culture, the museums and the public galleries, and saying, what are we doing? What's our footprint? And really taking a close look at that. And so as I understand from that article, they're now developing procedures to try and rein that in. So, but it's true. I mean, I'm a guy. I work with climates and environmental issues every single day, and that's my job, is to bring these to light. And yet, of course, I realize I'm still as guilty as anybody, which in many cases is exactly why I was speaking to the Last Stand series and this sort of familiar responsibility, and that my family is still cutting down old growth, right? So it speaks to being the realization that I'm part of the problem. I'm in there with it. I'm not trying to be the artist that is preaching from on high.
We could not walk through our homes at night and not see that we were part of the problem. We had wooden furniture, so we exploited things because we were smart.
Yes, absolutely. But there are ways to do things sustainably.
Oh yes, there are.
So, and with going back to that particular issue, I spoke earlier about sustainability and how we use that word sustainability. But what does that actually mean? And does anybody here have any idea what sustainability actually means from a scientific or mathematical perspective?
Isn't it in balance? Sustainable is balanced within the ecosystem. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. But what does but then what? So we say it's in balance. So how do we figure that out?
We have to give back, so we have to plant these trees back.
We have to plant trees.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yes, you got a point?
Well, the way foresters do this sometimes
Yeah.
is measure the rate of growth of trees in an existing stand.
Yeah.
Find the cubic meters of growth per
Yeah.
hectare
Yeah.
in a particular year.
Yes.
And then use that as your annual allowable cut.
There's a man who's after my own heart here. Yes, just let me hold on one sec, because that's exactly I'm very inspired by my father. He was one of the original people who worked for 25 years to get that the Community Eco-Forestry Society going on Cortez, and finally get approval from the provincial government. And so watching him do that single-minded task for 25 years to make that happen, kind of blew me out of the water. I was like, I don't think I know anybody who does that for 25 years, like one task, just always on the side, just going, and it worked. And he also was constantly doing studies on the word sustainable. What does that actually mean? And he spoke exactly to what you just mentioned, sir, about the looking at what essentially are predator-prey relationships in the natural world. And so how do the natural systems stay sustainable? Because they figured it out, right? So he studied for 25 years, he studied sustainability in other predator-prey relationships, and you could argue that with us in the forest, that's a very good example of predator-prey relationship. And so what he was looking at, or what he discovered, is that on average, there's anywhere from a 12 to 20, I'm going to probably get the exact number wrong, 12 to 22% harvest of the annual incremental growth of any prey population that year. If the predator takes anywhere from 15 to 22% out of it, just of the growth, not of the entire amount, that it can be sustainable. It can sustain it in the long term. And so then you start to look at that with forestry, you look at that with farming and hunting and all these other things, and you realize that those numbers within that zone can lead to a sustainable relationship with any prey population. And so for me personally, that really struck home that there's a quantifiable number that we can say that is sustainable right there. We now, for me, I now can say that that is a sustainable number, and if we take more than that, eventually it's going to be unsustainable because it's going to be out of balance. So that's, for me, when my dad did that, and he's published that just in his local area on Cortez, and I've actually used that information in the show in Campbell River and in the museum there. It's on the wall about that particular amount, because I think that kind of information, it seems to me, it's grounded in such common sense and also in science. And so that we should be using things like that. Why don't we all know that? I mean, my God, that's such a simple, really, when you actually think about it, I mean, sometimes it took 25 years for that to come out and make sure with the scientific method that you're correct in those numbers. But why don't we now use that? Yes?
I was here in the 70s and there was logging going on, and I worked for a family, the Hollings in Fulford.
Mm-hmm.
And they were a little logging company, right? A family that logged, like your family.
Yeah.
And they were very concerned about the wood and the forests and what was going on. And I found that my dad, who worked for McMillan and Blondell,
Yeah.
just went in and took everything and then sold out the Crown Zellerack or whatever and took everything. It isn't the little guys. It isn't the guy that's trying to make a living. That's the problem. Because they need to make a living, so they're aware of what the commodities are.
Yes.
It's only when we go big, then we're in trouble.
I agree. I absolutely agree.
And then it isn't sustainable.
Yeah, no, it's
way.
it's corporate capitalism is what it is. It's the real issue. It's
greedy.
corporate consumer capital anyway. That's what we want that. Yes.
Seriously.
Yeah,
I know that we talk about this is all long term.
But you're thinking more like the property.
No, no. Buying property and clear cutting.
That's what I meant, they're
Yeah.
taking their property.
Excuse me, you guys just got a question up front here, sorry.
No, I know it's not for the long term, but I've been here for over 30 years.
Yeah.
And I documented the changes on this island.
Mm-hmm.
And people are shocked when I say, I actually have 8 by 10 negatives and 4 by 5 negatives of all these places that were not here.
Mm-hmm.
And all the places that they
Yeah.
clear cut and stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm having a problem when I take a little walk up my home areas, and I'm seeing that people are demolishing homes and putting huge homes up and clear cutting everything on that area.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the little places that used to be little creeks, and I don't know where or what, but I didn't hear the trees going down or anything. But it's a shock to see these things. And I feel like this is a long term, it's never going to end until the day I die.
Mm-hmm.
That I need to document these changes.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, would you, I'm sure that that's in the back of your mind, that all these projects are never going to end with you. Is that true?
That's very true.
Yeah.
I think I'll be doing these till the day I die.
Yeah,
Really.
because it's in you now.
Yeah, for sure. That's just how I was raised, and that's why I'm in this part of the world,
Yeah.
and that's why I want to be around here. Because let's face it, this is still one of the best places around in the world. It's relatively unpolluted. We're even with all of the issues that we have. I mean, the western edge of Canada, North America, was one of the very last places to be colonized. Right, when you think about it, in the role of colonization around the world. Of course, there's other places that came after, but in terms of the grand scheme of things, this part of the world was one of the last, and so I think that's why things are still relatively reasonable here.
But we still have a role in seeing,
Well, yeah,
overseeing these things
for sure.
and making a stand.
Yes,
That's the thing.
absolutely. And, you know, I'm sure for many cases, it's gonna be too late, to be quite frank, at this
Yeah.
stage of the game. When you see what's happening to the forest now with the multiple fronts that they're trying to survive against, with the insects that are coming up now because of the temperatures and forest fires because of the climate change, and
Yeah.
and we all see now the cedars, right? We see the cedars are now dying, like we're losing our cedar trees, like the most iconic species of this area. And I don't know what to say about that. I mean, well, that's another project I'm working on right now, but so I'll have something to say soon. But I mean, I think that we just have to look at these things and realize the scale of them all. And then when you put them together, it's completely overwhelming. But for me, there's just no other option. I think of the writer Chris Hedges. Some of you might know Chris Hedges. He writes a lot for Shrewsbury, and he is very pessimistic about our future. But he says our saving grace is human nature, the good elements of human nature, and he makes an analogy to the concentration camps during the Second World War, and how even there's recordings and evidence that even during the life of the people who were in the concentration camps, there were still moments of beauty, and still moments of kindness, and still moments of love. And so even in what could be considered one of the very darkest times of human history, that even during that time, the humans still rose above and were able to exhibit those human tendencies to each other. And you know, it's not everybody, but I think that when it gets down to it, I think most of us would be the same. You know, and so again, as I said earlier, no matter how bad it gets, I think that there's always going to be beauty in the world of some kind, and we have to cling to that. And part of that is being in communities and being out in nature and really realizing sort of, you know, the importance of life itself, because that's what we're killing, is life itself. So. On that note, let's go have a drink for God's sake. Okay, enough of this.